Okay, we're recording. So, Lacey, we are live and welcome everyone. This is the Welcome to the Therapist Saddle, exploring equine engagement for self-care. This is something that both Lacey and I are familiar with, and it is part of an ongoing assignment that we've had, and we're hoping to make this very relevant. And our our audience is not necessarily equine therapists. It's all the other people out there that are saying, what is equine therapy? What is equine learning? And what would this look like if I was to refer a client to an equine therapist or an equine program? Lacey and I are going to explain that. Okay. So I thought we would start by saying this is an introduction. We're going to explore this, its benefits and challenges and implementation, but we're not going to bore you by rereading our slips, our slides. Sorry, it was a Freudian slip right there. We're going to explain to you how it works by sharing a narrative with you. And the narratives are very important because the narratives support the research that we're presenting in this particular slide. So what you're going to hear is kind of a radio show format where I'm going to ask some very specific questions for Lacey, because Lacey works both ends of this. I use equine therapy myself because that's my self-care. Lacey works both sides. She not only does it and has done it her entire life, but she offers this therapy modality for other people as well. Okay, so do you have anything to add to this before I ask you a question, Lacey? Aside that my furry pal is about 900 pounds and it sounds like yours is about 1,100 pounds.
Yeah, mine are a bit heftier. No, I think you got it straight to the point. I think we can move forward.
Okay, good. So we have some terms here. So Lacey, tell us about groundwork versus co-regulation, equine-assisted activities versus equine-assisted therapy.
So with groundwork, it's working with a facilitator or an individual that has that experience working with horses. It's not riding the horses, but it's leading them around, catching them, learning how to put on the halter, lunging them, which means you're hanging on to them and you're letting them run around you while having control. You're able to brush them, braid their manes, have that hands-on approach before building up that trust to riding with them. With co-regulation, because horses are able to mirror energies, it's really important, and it's a great tool or process to work with kids who have ADHD, OCD, or ADD, to work with them so that they can learn about themselves while working with the horses. Because when I work with children, I always let them know that we have to have quiet bodies, meaning we have to be really cautious of how we're moving around, because horses are flight or fight animals. If they get scared, they will take right off, which can be dangerous, especially if you're in their pathway. So having that co-regulation when working with the horses from a hands-on approach does allow that awareness, especially for children. So it's a really great tool or therapy when working with children in that sense. Equine assisted activities. Again, it's more of the foundation work or equine assisted learning. That's what it does. And it offers that social emotional awareness, like learning about your emotions, understanding what your body does when you're under that stress, and just working with the horses and that. And it's usually done in group work rather than a one-on-one. With equine assisted therapy or equine therapy, it's more of a one-on-one approach, which I practice. And that's at the master's level education that you would require to do this one-on-one approach. Because when I do equine therapy, it's the one-on-one, but we really focus on that trauma aspect to understand why are they experiencing these challenges or these everyday stressors that's impacting their overall well-being. With equine assisted learning, again, you can take the training, but you do not need that master's level education, as it's done in group work, as it's more of the foundation to the introduction of equine therapy.
Okay, so thank you, Lacey, for clearing all that up. Now, the next slide, which talks about area and strategy. To cover all of these points, Lacey, there was a very endearing story that you had shared with me, which I think captures about just a huge amount of work and a huge amount of what they're trying to tell us in the word literature when we did our research for this. They speak to self-care strategies, they speak to being able to communicate, and they speak to what is the strategy that we use behind pairing people with these magnificent animals. And you told me that story about that little girl. I was wondering if you could share that with us.
So the thing with horses is they're very unique in their sense. Like they are 1,100-pound animals, give or take. And the thing is that they have so much compassion to an individual. They're just like us. You know, I've had horses who've had such deep trauma where I had to approach them as if I would approach a client with complex trauma. So for one example is I was doing a group session with a class of grade 4 or 5 split. And what I notice when I do these group sessions, I have everyone stand in the circle, which meaning the students and the teachers and myself. I let my horses go and I just tell them, just stand in the circle, don't move, and just let them run around. And eventually the horses will quiet down. They'll start sniffing everyone. They actually sniffed one of the teachers and she was pregnant with twins. So it was kind of interesting to see, like they kept like smelling her belly because they knew there was life in there. But the one thing that really stood out is this one horse who is a mare, meaning she's female and a mother, would kept going to this one young girl. And eventually all the other horses started like doing the same thing. They were following that mother. And that mare, she was almost tucking that girl, like she was trying to give her a hug. She was trying to guard her. She was trying to protect her. And the teachers were asking, like, you know, should we shoo them away? And I said, no, just leave them because, you know, the horses sense something that that little girl needs. So for majority of the session, like that mare stood by that girl for the entire time, would follow her around and whatnot. And a few days later, what we found out is that little girl's mom died. And no one knew about it, but those horses knew. Those horses knew that that girl needed some love in that moment and some kind of connection. And it was really good to see that that was the start of that girl being able to process a lot of her grief, because she grew up in a very I guess what term describes as a broken home. So it was quite nice to know, you know, like years later when she said, you know, I still remember that moment when your horse came up to me and she said I needed that love in that moment. So it's good to see what these horses can do that we don't know, you know. So they offer a connection and a safe space that sometimes we as therapists can offer.
Mm-hmm. It's a very important part of it. And the other aspect that you bring, as we all know, because in our cohort, we're familiar with you, is your Indigenous background. When you're talking about the strategy, the equine engagement can be practiced to build rapport with the Indigenous populations through a two-eyed lens approach. What is the true meaning of that in layman's English?
So a two-eyed lens approach meaning is to take the Indigenous aspect with the Western aspect, or holistic and Western, and combine it together to meet the needs of that client. Because today we really practice from a client-centered approach of meeting them where they're at. And that two-eyed lens approach really incorporates the culture, the traditions, the protocols, the language with Western practices to meet the needs of that clientele. So again, because I'm Indigenous and I'm practicing from that two-eyed lens of having my own culture and language a part of my practice, while also incorporating like the ethics and standards of practice to ensure or to prevent any liability. That's how I practice. And it also allows for reconciliation, because what we want to do is not to place blame on anyone, but to learn from the past, acknowledge the past, and also work together to unlearn the behavior, because a lot of the trauma within Indigenous populations is learned behavior. It's what we've learned to know what is normal, what is healthier, or what love is. And that's where we have to unlearn a lot of that, because that learned behavior is a lot of abuse. It's a lot of pain in various aspects. So when I do it from an Indigenous perspective, it really means is being organic, be authentic. And, you know, as in therapists, that's something that we do, is to be authentic and to have that compassion to meet them where they're at. But the horses can offer a great aspect to it too, because horses have always been a part of Indigenous culture for many, many generations. And we see them as not just an animal or a pet, but as someone at our same level, because horses do protect us in many ways. And I know from an Indigenous perspective, horses will guard us. Oh, they'll take the hit for us, as what my grandpa would say. You know, one year my horse got really hurt one time, but I had a medicine man tell me that there's people trying to attack you, but your horses are taking the hit for you because they love you so much. So in that way, horses just have that sense. And when we build that trust and rapport with them, they protect us in ways that we don't even know.
So this is a lot deeper, these stories that you're telling us. And I just want to say that we are covering the material here, but we're covering it from a very narrative, a very story perspective. And the difference between the lens that you bring here and the concept that we call in normal psychology outside of that, which is a pluralism, is really, it doesn't acknowledge any single approach that works for all individuals, that this is going to be very centered. And it's actually an approach that is very unique for each and every client in each and every combination of force and the combination of, you know, the underlying issues we're dealing with, the deep traumas, or, you know, it's beyond integrative. And not because we're putting forces together here, but because we're also putting in a deep ethical aspect of it and a very deep cultural aspect of it. I was wondering if you could share one more story to sort of bring together how we are going to address the problem statement of what equine therapy can bring in addition to conventional self-care. Movement-based interventions is the one people are most used to. However, it goes deeper than that from a self-regulation perspective, which you gave us a beautiful narrative on that story. But you have yet another story that will bring a lot of what they're trying to tell us in the research that's available to us. And the story I'm talking about, Lacey, is the one about a young girl that you worked with for a very long period of time. And you got to watch her develop from what I call ground zero to a very productive outcome, so that people will get an idea that it's not like getting out and riding in nature once a week. It's more about working in combination from a very therapeutic perspective.
So when I came back to my community before I got my master's level education, I worked as a family school liaison, and part of that role was I hosted or facilitated a girls group. And it was for girls from my community who were vulnerable to a high risk lifestyle, meaning like human trafficking, sex trafficking, vulnerable to substances and whatnot. And I had about 6 to 8 girls. I started working with them in January, and then over time I started to build that rapport with them. And what I found out about this one young girl, her mother and sister died in a house fire. It was very tragic, very sudden. It was one of those situations where no one could expect it. And, you know, she had to go live with her sister, and she was kind of like the Cinderella in that story, where she didn't really get a lot of support or a lot of attention. So when she would come to school, her hood was always over her head. She wouldn't talk, didn't want to be there half the time. She wouldn't engage in her schoolwork. Like, she was just going downhill. And because there was so much trauma, like, we could kind of forecast to see like the route she was taking. Within the schools, there were school counselors, there were psychologists. Like, they tried the Western perspective of supports, and it just wasn't working. She wasn't opening up to anyone. But we could see that grief was really taking over her. And within May, I said, you know, okay, one day we're gonna go ride horses. And the arena was 10 minutes from the school. Like, we walked there. And she didn't want to get on at first, but then she started to see all the other girls really enjoying it. And she said, okay, I want to try, but I want to get on your horse. And I said, okay, you can get on my horse. And his name was Houdini. He's actually one of my top therapy horses, but also my competitive horse. And she got on him, and when it was really interesting to see, because that was the first time any of us ever seen her smile and laugh. And that's the horse in that picture right there, Houdini, you know him. He's such a gentle giant. He's like my biggest horse ever, but he just knows when to be gentle with kids. And she just enjoyed herself. I've never seen her smile. I've never seen her laugh so much just from one session. So it was really great to see what Houdini was able to offer her in that moment, because after that, like, we continued to go to the Agriplex to ride horses until the end of the school year. And that next following year, this girl was a complete turnaround. She was going to school every day. She was on the basketball team. She was actually processing her emotions and her grief, like, meaning she was reaching out for help. She would be like, I need to talk to you, and allowing herself to be vulnerable, which was such a huge step. And I really commend her for that. Until this day, like, she graduated high school. And it's just great to see how this horse changed her path when she could have ended up in a different path. And that's all it took, was to have a connection to this animal. And, I'm very grateful that I was able to do that for this young girl, because it's great to see what she's been accomplishing since then.
It is, yeah. So thanks for sharing that. I'm going to back up just a bit now that everybody knows who you're talking about, who Houdini is. We're going to go back to the literature review, because we made note that the literature review is very conventional. It talks about, equine engagement for therapists, self-care. They talk about engagement and emotional regulation. And your stories, I think, really explain that a lot better than the articles do. But now we're going to talk about transitioning from riding to, which is non-horse ownership, through what ownership looks like, feasibility and barriers, because a lot of people write it off a little too quickly. And there are some other options available to everybody for being able to have access to these animals. So we're going to work through that in our limited time that's available, and talk about transition from riding to ownership. I've done home ownership, not currently. I'm currently now just taking riding lessons, getting back into it, looking for the next perfect furry pal. Whereas Lacey currently has, and always has, had access to animals because of her access to, the land, the rural environment. So tell us a little bit about that. And then I think after this slide, we'll go to what certifications are necessary to be able to pull this off correctly, ethically, the ethical aspect of this.
So when it comes to owning horses, and maybe that's kind of part of the lack of the literature review, because not everyone is able to do this for some more practice, but it doesn't mean they can't access it. So I know for myself, I'm very fortunate to be able to practice equine therapy and offer it, because I do have the land. My horses are in my backyard just as we speak. I can see them from my office window. I grew up knowing how to take care of them. Like, I have over 25 years experience working with horses, training horses. So it is quite a costly investment. So to get into this area, there's a lot of resources and a lot of research that needs to be done before moving towards that ownership, because horses are very expensive animals, especially with the economy now. I know to feed 5 horses a year, it costs me over $10,000, but even to transport them with the proper truck and trailer, that's over $150,000 for that rig itself. But for the care as well can be quite costly. So again, it just depends on where you're wanting to, how deep you want to get into this, because to be an equine therapist, there's very, very minimum of us, I guess you could say. There's a lot of equine assisted learning practitioners, which is great, but to find an equine therapist that can do the one-on-one deep trauma work, it's very rare to find.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Just to add to that quickly, is I'm in the process of finding the perfect furry pal to get back into it. I have some traveling to do. I have some sources to make, but for right now, I'm paired and I'm currently in a bonding scenario with I'd put about 1,000 pounds. Bert, he's very large in personality, and he's also very large in his movements. And we're
Mhm.
learning about each other. Maybe Bert will be my next pal. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. But I'm paying, just to throw some numbers out there so that people aren't too afraid, is I pay $55 for a lesson, but it is not with a therapist. This is just for my own personal self-care. And
Yeah,
it's important to Lacey and I that you understand the difference between the two. So that's why
yeah,
we're coming up with this slide here.
yeah. And I think the
Yeah.
difference, like what you say, Linda, is that if you're just doing writing lessons, it's like a $55 charge, dependent what the trainer will charge. But for equine therapy, I charge anywhere from 200 to 250 for 90-minute sessions because that's in-depth therapy. I also offer riding lessons, but that will be like maybe $60 for an hour. So again, there's a big difference between the two. So it's really knowing what is available and what you're wanting to access.
Mhm.
Mhm.
That's absolutely true. And you have to be careful where you get your certifications from. I did take the time as part of our progression, and we're supposed to work through this week and actually prove that we've done some work. I called some of my larger people that I do insurance billing with, like the Big Sun Lifes and the Canada Lifes. And if you're going to offer that particular service, you have to actually prove to them that you have the credentials, and then your client can indeed use their benefits to engage in equine therapy. So that might be something that you can go to them and ask them who in your area is certified, who's already certified, as opposed to going out and doing it the other way, because there are differences. What are the different terms out there? There's equine assisted therapy, which is the formal therapy. There's equine assisted learning, and then there's equine assisted. There's a couple of them, but the only one that really counts is the therapy one, right?
Yeah, and I think so the thing to really remember, because I know there's another, I don't say organization, but another group of individuals who are practicing equine assisted learning. And they were saying they were doing equine therapy. And I told them, you have to be careful because that can be a big fine, especially if you don't have the credentials to be saying you're a therapist. So definitely be cautious of that because you need that master's level education and to be a part of a governing body to say that you're an equine therapist. So for the equine assisted learning, you can take a week training from various places such as this, what Linda shares on the slide, and say that you can facilitate equine assisted learning sessions at a foundation level to provide that awareness of social emotional learning. But for equine therapy, that's more of the one-on-one approach or talking about trauma and whatnot. So it's definitely important to know the difference between the two because I still see that some people are saying they're doing therapy and they're not. So and when I try to offer some advice, sometimes it gets taken in the wrong way, but that's okay.
No, but you got to set boundaries, and
Mhm.
ethically, that's part of what we do, is bring this to people's attention. Um, I look back now at all my work that I've done with Pony Club, in kids, and all of those, riding lessons I used to give. And it's like 4-H club thing, but it's a Pony Club thing. I wouldn't call that equine assisted therapy by any remote sense of the word. Maybe learning,
Yeah.
from an organization like that, but definitely not from a therapy perspective. So that it takes more than just a horse, and it takes more than just a person to be able to do the actual therapy part. Okay,
Mhm.
so yeah, so we're available this week to answer any questions if anybody sees this post. And if you do have any questions, let us know. We've put some really great literature in here for you
Mhm.
that will back up pretty much everything that we covered in the story tells that we presented today.
Mhm.
Okay, do you have anything else to add, Lacey, or is that going to be?
No, I think that's about it. And again, when it comes to
Yeah.
the literature review, there's very limited articles. Like the ones I found is more based on first responders or individuals with disabilities, but nothing for self-care or for therapists, or there's very limited on Indigenous aspects as well. But it just means that there's so much more room to grow and to research it. But maybe the access to it is one of the challenges and barriers to getting that research.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Lacey, and thank you everyone for listening. We're
Thank you.
glad. Hey, thanks.